about 1 year after that, I met Islamic Thinkers Society, an organization in New York City that was an offshoot of al-Muhajirun. They used to do these street dawah stalls. You're very familiar with the street dawah approach of al-Muhajirun, but the idea was person-to-person. Proselytization was key.
As someone who worked in counterterrorism for the Canadian Security Intelligence Service for a decade and a half, I have some certain very biased opinions on what terrorism is and more importantly, what we need to do about it. Clearly, as somebody who worked in security intelligence, we investigated terrorists, hopefully before they acted, passed information on to law enforcement so that people could be stopped before they set off bombs or carry out suicide attacks, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a whole other side to counterterrorism that's really gained a lot of followers in the past couple of years. And this is a field that's generally called CVE, or countering violent extremism. And it kind of says you can work at the early stages of what we call radicalization to violence and get people to change their minds before they go off and sign a contract with Islamic State or Al-QAEDA. And a lot of money is being thrown by a lot of governments at these programs. A lot of claims are being made about the success rate of doing this. And then something happens which puts the whole thing into a completely different conversation piece. So a little more, almost 2 years ago, in late November 2019, 5 people were stabbed. In fact, 2 were killed in central London by a British man named Usman Khan, who had been jailed for terrorism, been released in 2018 after serving a short sentence, and he was sort of the poster boy for the counter-radicalization movement in the United Kingdom. He got out. They're actually attending a conference to celebrate the 5th anniversary of a program called Learning Together, and he pulled out a knife and he fatally stabbed 2 people. This called into question a lot of what's happening. So to look at these types of issues today, I've got on a very special guest, someone I've come to know over the last couple of years. His name is Jesse Morton. He's joining me from Washington, D.C. He was one of the founders of Revolution Muslim, which was an organization back in the mid-2000s that really kind of was a propaganda or proselytizer for Al-QAEDA. And so Jesse's agreed to come on the program today to talk about matters concerning counter-radicalization and CV. So Jesse, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Let's start with first principles. Jesse, can you walk my listeners through you were a convert to Islam, you weren't born Muslim, sort of a little bit about that process, and more importantly, how you ended up being, as one newspaper called you, a major recruiter for Al-QAEDA in the United States in the early 2000s.
Oh, sure. I'll give you the abbreviated version so that we have time to talk about the other things, but I'm happy to go through the trajectory. It's important to point out that everybody's trajectory into violent extremist entity or organization or identity is unique to some
Very much
degree.
so, yes.
But there are patterns that we try to identify. I think sometimes we look for patterns because that's how we're predisposed. But nevertheless, it's important to point out that typically radicalization into violent extremism is a process. It's not an event. Right. And for me, not unlike many, many others, it starts with a very traumatic upbringing that created what, you'll know this, Quentin Wictorowicz called a cognitive opening.
Absolutely, yes.
A bit of an oversimplification, but I was abused pretty seriously as a child by my mother. My father was from outside of New York City, an affluent son of a prominent attorney, but he himself had a cognitive opening or a sort of life-altering circumstance in his senior year of high school where his father passed away out of nowhere. His father was set to be the youngest Supreme Court justice in New Jersey. He was set himself to be a lawyer, but he decided rather to fall into counterculture movement of that era, which was a far leftist beatnik approach. And essentially he moved to Pennsylvania, where he went for his undergraduate pre-law degree, met a very local woman from a working class background, my mother in Pennsylvania, and impregnated her. And as a result of that, decided that he really didn't want to participate in American society. So we grew up on a farm out in the middle of nowhere, growing our own organic fruit, growing marijuana in the woodshed, and basically living a very hippie lifestyle. And I say that because it was a very idealistic and irrational idea. because my father, in many ways, abandoned the early concepts that he had by the time I was like 2 years old. He was cheating with my mother with another woman. My mother was beating us physically, and we were in the middle of nowhere, so nobody could hear the screams, the cries.
Oh
But
my
it
God.
cultivated in me a personality where I was a savior, or I was willing to self-sacrifice. So one of the things that happens with trauma is you disassociate. So you leave your body essentially, and your mind becomes detached from your body because you need to cope, and you need to learn how to cope, and you shut down, or you rise above and you sort of step up and encounter your oppressor, so to say. And I was the one in the family who stood up to the abuser. I protected my sister and developed in myself this idea that self-sacrifice was a good thing. And essentially that set forth a pattern in my life where when I started to go to school, I went to a very rural school and I had a very high IQ or whatnot. So they sent me for private school with the affluent kids. And I developed a very serious class concept because it seemed like people were living in very much two different realities. There was the
Of
rich,
course.
there was the affluent, and then there was the poor working class. And instead
Right.
of just see myself as a savior for my sister, I saw myself as someone who saw a very serious attitude of privilege and pretentiousness. This is just the way I experienced things. And I think it was resentment because no one really intervened. No one really cared. They cared about me if I was good at sports. They cared about me because I was different than the class I came from, so to say. But other than that, I was always considered an outsider. My father was from Jersey, blah, blah, blah. He was a hippie. He smoked weed on all of this situation. So I became very, very much class-based resentments all through life. At 15 years old, I ran away and I followed and emulated my father's footsteps out back of Port Authority, which is on 42nd Street and 8th Ave in New York City, a very classic bus terminal. I met a bunch of hippies, ended up traveling with the Grateful Dead, which is a way to live in a counterculture.
With the Grateful Dead? Seriously?
Yes, indeed. I traveled with the Grateful Dead. For your listeners that don't know, it's a 1960s counterculture band.
Absolutely.
Basically travels all over the country. And what I did was I sold drugs in their parking lot and then graduated to using the drugs that I was selling and then other narcotics, and became very much, as a consequence of my trauma, I do believe there's a predisposition for addiction, ended up being an addict and ended up getting in trouble. And when I was in jail for the very first time in my life, I read the autobiography of Malcolm X. It wasn't an immediate change, but it set forth an ability for me to tap into that archetype. And I wanted to become a social activist. I wanted to become a social justice warrior. I was firmly committed to overthrowing capitalism. I hated the United States. And this is previous to 9/11. And I walked around after getting out of my first stint in jail with the autobiography of Malcolm X firmly planted in my mind, never read the Quran. So I like to say now that it's probably true in a simplified way to say that I adopted the religion of Malcolm, the religion of Islam as understood by Malcolm X, not the religion of Islam as understood by Muhammad from the very first time. But I explored with religion. I was very reluctant to become religious because my father was overly secular, and very much I was raised in an environment that considered religion to be dim-witted. But with the thing that appeals a lot to converts to Islam is the notion that Islam is compatible with science. And in fact, there's a lot of, whether it's propaganda, reality is a different conversation, but there's a very easy bridge to build between conversion and the types of information that's available for Muslims, new and old, that shows this documentation of the Quran as being compatible with science. And that really appeals to people that are born into the West. However, what happened with my fascination in digging into that is I still lived a very, very, very unhealthy lifestyle. So approximately a year after reading the autobiography of Malcolm X, I was in Philadelphia, and I'm downtown Philadelphia hustling drugs, and I'm hustling with a partner who is a Salafist Muslim. Philadelphia has a very serious influence from Saudi Arabian fundamentalist Wahhabist Islam. And
I didn't know that. In Philadelphia.
A huge community.
Wow.
But a lot of people adopt that interpretation of Islam in the American prison system where it's predominant. And they come home and they've learned how to follow rules, but they no longer follow the rules when they come home from incarceration. And there's an individual named Shakur that did so. Shakur found me on the street and we were hustling together, and he had this beard and it just looked exactly like a Salafi, but he was downtown, hustling or whatnot. We went to Uptown. We used to serve corporate execs, lawyers, more of that animosity against the class carried out in my adulthood. I used to serve them drugs, prostitutes, etc. And we used to have to run up to the ghetto, me being a white person, to cop drugs, bringing them back down so that we could serve, those that were looking to party on the weekends in town for business, so to say.
Right.
And we got arrested, or we were about to get arrested. Coming out of the ghetto, they shine the lights down on us. They're like, lay down. Of course, we don't lay down. We had drugs on us. We ran to what they call in Philadelphia an abandonmenium. And long story short, Shakur looks to me and he says, just say these words, we're going to be okay. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah.
Right.
I don't know what he's saying. I
Right.
do know we got away. It's the Shahada, the testimony.
Yeah, it's in Arabic, of course, yeah.
Yep, it's the Shahada, the testimony to Islam. He takes me to his wife's house and they go to sleep. I fall asleep on the couch. I've been high for days, running around downtown. I mean, completely exhausted. I wake up in the morning and I go to the bathroom and here's the Quran sitting open on a bookshelf. And I grab it. They're still in the bed and I start to read it. First verse I read, this is a book wherein there's no doubt. It says a guidance for people of taqwa, or people of consciousness. Right. And I continue to read. I'm overcome with emotions. I start to cry. And I decide that it's time for me to change my life. The next day, he asked me to leave later that day. I take my Shahada. We go to the Salafist mosque. I don't know much about Islam, and I end up in Richmond, Virginia, which is a couple hours away from Philadelphia, and I get arrested for selling false narcotics to an undercover cop. So I spent 6 months in a Virginia jail waiting for drugs to come back from a lab that I knew were false. And in the course of that experience, I met a Moroccan veteran of the Afghan Soviet jihad. A Moroccan. Okay. Yes. And he was very keen. The first thing I told him was I converted to Islam, but I don't know anything. He taught me how to pray. Once I learned how to pray in Arabic, he says, okay, now you're ready for your official, declaration of faith. It's a prerequisite that you know how to pray. Now you can really become a Muslim. Go into the jailhouse shower, scrub every inch of your body, because when you take your actual testimony of faith, you're going to be like a baby. Everything that happened before you is going to be washed away, and I'm going to give you a new name and a new mission, essentially. So I do that, and I feel like, wow, I can finally kill this guy, Jesse Morton, who is a piece of shit, and I hate. Right. And so I come out, and he gives me my testimony of faith, white sheet, all the Muslims on the in the cell block are there, everybody hugging, and holding, and then he says, here's your new name. Your new name is Younes Abdullah Muhammad. Younes is Jonah in the Bible. He's swallowed by a whale, runs away from God's directive, feels God, and then is spit back up on the shore, and is one of the only successful prophets because he goes and he calls his people to Islam and they all convert, the people of Manila. Right. And he says, that's your job. You're going to go back to America and you're going to preach them the true religion and change your life. And Abdullah means that you're a slave of God. You're nothing. You're basically subject to following God's law, and the way that you understand that law is Muhammad. So I'm giving you the best name, the most honorable name in the world, because Muhammad is the final messenger of God, and he has brought the complete Sharia, and blazi. So very invigorating conversation. About 2 weeks later, he's praying in the cell block. We call the adhan, the call to prayer for Fajr, in the cell block. A Christian wakes up, a very big African-American Christian, by the way, wakes up and says, goes and stands in front of the salat, the prayer. And the Moroccan tries to move him away from the front of it. And he doesn't move. And all of a sudden, in the middle of what is supposed to be a spiritual tradition, the Moroccan stands up. He's about 5'8" and fights this guy and gets beat up. And I'm like, what we're in prayer. How does it go from prayer to fight? And he explains to me in the back of the cell block that the Prophet has recorded a hadith and we have to follow the Prophet. And the Prophet Muhammad is narrated to have said that if someone stands in front of the prayer, then try to move them gently with your right hand to the side. And if they don't move, then stand up and fight them, for verily they're a shaitan. Now, in America, we're not really comfortable with religion as having this violent aspect, and violence as being just. I mean, people do think about it, that take the religion seriously, but I had never come across such a thing. And it was in that moment that I sort of understood that, let's just say, this was something different, that this was an intoxication that was a little bit different than anything I had experienced. But it was intriguing. I had always been a pacifist. And then he explains to me that the Taliban has established an Islamic State in Afghanistan, and that there would never be a way for the West to accept it, and that I could expect a war between the kuffar and the Muslims that will last until the Day of Judgment, but the Muslims will be victorious. And he explains to me for the first time the prophecy that also is that lore for a conversion, because there's this utopic future, right, that's coincident to a lot of radical ideologies. If we just tear down what exists and what is
Yeah,
powerful now
of
and take
course.
power, right, we can
Yeah.
create a utopia on earth, not unlike socialism, right? And so and he explains to me that the black flags will be raised in Khorasan and they will not be stopped until they reach Jerusalem. This is
Mhm.
another hadith attributed
Mhm.
to the Prophet Muhammad. And that this raising of the black flags in Afghanistan, I would see in my lifetime, would begin to be the birth of this sort of trek of global war leading up to Armageddon, like the Christians understand it. It's called Malhama in the Arabic language. Now, I don't
Mhm.
know all of this then, but I definitely learned it thereafter. I go back to American society. 9/11 happens. George Bush tells us, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. I'm
Mhm.
living in Harlem, converting people to Islam as instructed. I've changed my life, completely stopped using drugs, stopped smoking cigarettes, stopped drinking alcohol, stopped even having, making love to people, having sex, and was really living this sort of austere life. And in so many ways, it was healthy for me. So I started to go
Mhm.
to college from 15-year-old runaway, blah, blah, blah. But I also found myself on 125th Street in Harlem, which is a very active street for shoppers on the weekend. And I would criticize the war on terror and the Iraq War. People would stop and they would buy books from a bookseller who would basically employ me to stand there. And I found I had the gift of gab, so to say. Long story short, about 1 year after that, I met Islamic Thinkers Society, an organization in New York
Mhm.
City that was an offshoot of Al-Muhajirun. And they
Mhm.
used to do these street dawah stalls. You're very familiar with the
Yes.
street dawah approach of Al-Muhajirun, but the idea was person to person. Proselytization was key. But social media was rising, and I kept complaining to them, you can really connect to a lot more people if you have a website and if you work with, online arena. Like, this is really the next wave of promoting this truth. They really were opposed to it because they were strict adherents to Omar Bakri Muhammad. He, of course, was good at using the internet, but they themselves didn't think that it was appropriate. And the al-Muhajirunis, as you know, didn't make back then clear allegiance to Salafi jihadism. They had more of an alignment that was against Al-QAEDA and Osama bin Laden. And I was getting mesmerized by a preacher called Abdullah Faisal, a Jamaican cleric who was then in prison in the UK, who I started to establish written correspondence with. So Abdullah Faisal comes home in 2007, and I decide that because they won't listen to me and because now I have the legitimacy of an authentic preacher, and someone who's exploring with this new medium called YouTube, Yusuf Al-Khattab, an Orthodox Jewish convert, who had a prominent YouTube following online presence in the Muslim community because Richard Dawkins went to interview him. He lived under Israeli occupation of Gaza, secretly converted to Islam, ended up in Jerusalem, fascinating story, and was a fundamentalist. So I took what he would later describe in court. I asked Yusuf, if he wanted to start this new organization. He said, "Well, you're the smart guy. I'm just a clown." And I said, "Yeah. Go ahead, be the clown. That's what we need. Make it viral." Abdullah Faisal gave us the religious veneer, and I was kind of the puppeteer behind the scenes, who was using a lot of the skills I had developed as a street kid. And an understanding of the importance of messaging to organize rather than have all these charismatic preachers operating in silos. I put them together. We created a hub called revolutionmuslim.com. We were the very first kind of organization to tap into social media in a prolific way. We used Twitter, we used YouTube. This is when they were first rising in importance. And soon we saw our videos having, hundreds of thousands of views. Abdullah Faisal was gaining traction. We were inserting him into the mindset of the American Muslim community, which was then thought to be exceptional. Like, everybody thought American Muslims couldn't radicalize because they had higher levels of educational attainment, higher levels of
Mhm.
employment. They didn't fit the criteria of lacking integration was the big thing back then. And we proved that that was wrong. The organization was very, very dangerous, connected to 15 different terrorist plots. And the final culminating episode was we threatened the writers of South Park for portraying the Prophet Muhammad in a cartoon,
Yes, I do recall that.
caused international controversy. And I knew that we had violated the First Amendment law that we had been so careful to protect. I wasn't responsible for the initial post, but ran with it.
Mhm.
And long story short, as a reverberation of that, Pakistan and Indonesia threatened to shut down Facebook because some woman out in Seattle started Everybody Draw Muhammad Day Facebook page.
Mhm.
They refused to take it down under free speech principles. And in reaction to that, my colleagues who I had worked with for several years here in the United States, Anwar al-Awlaki and Samir Khan, who had moved to join al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and were living in Yemen clandestinely, launched an iteration of a magazine that we started here in the United States that we called Jihad Recollections. And Jihad Recollections was the precursor to Inspire and Dabik and Rumia, the English language jihadist magazines that I would say are probably the most effective piece of propaganda that has radicalized individuals to violent extremism and given them recipes through which they can carry out acts of terrorism, probably still to this day in our contemporary, post social media 2.0 era. And that was like one of the innovations that I kind of brought to the table and designed. So I knew the game was up, basically. I ran to Morocco, where my ex-wife is from. We lived there for about a year before the U.S. released an indictment. And that's actually where my change started. Because while I'm living in Morocco, I'm not connected with the charismatic preachers anymore. I'm not connected with the community. And it's all about community. It's all about groupthink. And so I didn't realize it, but I had extracted myself from that. And I started to get back a little bit of individuation and thought. And then the Arab Spring breaks out. And I'm teaching these millennial youth in Morocco to study for their master's degree programming abroad, hypocritically training them to leave the Middle East rather than to identify as Islam. But during the Arab Spring, we start to have these really interesting conversations where I get fascinated with Arab millennial youth and who want nothing to do with the utopic vision of a khilafah that I have, and are actually kind of they're mesmerizing because they want what I've taken for granted my whole life: the ability to express themselves, the ability to pursue a career in a free market, et cetera, et cetera. And it plants this seed. They kill Osama bin Laden while I'm over there, and then 3 days after they kill Osama bin Laden, they released a series of indictments. They were setting forth to wrap up all the English language recruiters. And they released an indictment for me. I was arrested coming out of a mosque, a Salafi jihadist mosque in Casablanca, and I spent 6 months in Moroccan jail, but I was privy and lucky enough to interact with my very first former extremist, his name is Mohammed Fizazi. He's a famous Salafi jihadist cleric who had changed his ways in prison and now speaks against radicalization. He would walk me around the yard, ask me questions about, my life. And it was very inspirational with regard to challenging some of my beliefs. The United States took me back on a private jet about 6 months after I was incarcerated. And they found me on the plane to be somewhat different, but they didn't know whether to believe me or not. Sent me back to the United States, where we're typically housing our terrorist offenders in solitary confinement. And I started to spend time locked in a cell 23 hours a day with 1 hour out of the cell, but convinced a guard to take me to the law library 4 days a week for her 10-hour shifts, and let me sit up in the law library surrounded by legal books, but also surrounded by the jailhouse regular library where I read a lot of philosophy, a lot of Western books, the Encyclopedia Britannica's great books of the Western world. And I started to reconfigure my thinking to the degree that by the time the FBI came to do what's called a debriefing process, when you plead guilty, you have to tell the truth about everything you know. And if you don't, they pull the plea. And in the course of doing that, I developed a very good relationship with a female FBI agent. Long story short, I guess she turned me. But I think I was definitely open to being turned. They asked, the first question they asked me when they first came to see me was, did I think the war on terror was winding down? I laughed at them. I said, "Are you serious? Serious? I knew Afghanistan. You have no clue. You're going to be dealing with this for 20 years." And they thought I was a joke at first. And then like Benghazi happened, and then ISIS starts to formulate. Jabhat al-Nusra takes off.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, a lot of my students end up over in Syria with the Beatles, with Junaid Hussein, and propagandizing, and they reach out and want to continue to conversate. And I had an opportunity and a choice to make. Did I want to become a apostate by helping the U.S. government capture people who were doing things like planning to poison the water supply and that were advocating and instructing people on how to commit terrorism, or did I want to retain this identity of super Muslim whatnot? I chose to help the FBI. I really thought that some of the mistaken notions that I had about them setting up Muslims, entrapping people, waging a war against Islam were clearly wrong. They were only worried about people like myself, and they were trying to get a better understanding of things themselves and learn from me. And so, I became an informant. Was released, originally sentenced to 11 and a half years in incarceration. But because of my cooperation, which eventually made its way to the judge, and they said that from a jailhouse in the federal prison system, I had gathered more intelligence on Americans that had traveled overseas than the collective of the intelligence units in the United States. And so the judge left me out immediately. And I was released on March 1st, 2015, in the aftermath of ISIS beheading the journalist,
Yep.
the war against the Khilafah, and went on to become an informant for them that was outed in the Washington Post as an informant, and kind of like, hey, he used to be a terrorist. Now the FBI is working with him a case went public, and my name was released in court. And so once they did that, I could no longer operate with the U.S. government. And so I had learned a lot and was questioned a lot while I was incarcerated about this new nascent field. I was locked up in 2011 when the United States started to flirt with countering violent extremism policy. In 2011, the Obama administration launched a strategic implementation plan.
Yes, I remember that.
And the FBI was supposed to head that initiative at first. And the FBI office came with, they, to their credit, they didn't bring law enforcement people. They had sociologists from Howard University working on it. And they would ask me questions, and they would send me, papers. And then I started to receive documents from academics in the field and correspondence with academics in the field, because I was developing a risk assessment tool for the FBI, blah, blah, blah. And so I was really caught up on the literature around this new field called CVE, and I was literally laughable with regard to the approaches that they were taking. Kept telling them that, listen, the only thing you guys need to do is develop an alternative mechanism to interdiction and intervention. You guys see all of the intelligence. You need to send people like me in to talk to these people. You don't need to arrest them. There's a lot of ways that you can develop a risk assessment tool that create an alternative intervention. But all this stuff you're doing with counter messaging, it's not that it won't work. It's that the people that are doing it don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And so I'm critical from the beginning. But when I was outed in the Washington Post, I decided, you know what, there's only one thing left to do, and that is to go public and to try to make amends in that manner. I liked working clandestinely and making amends for the horrible person and the horrible things I had done. But I went public as America's first former jihadist about 6 months after, joined the program on extremism at George Washington University as a research fellow. And then we might want to get into it, but probably need to save time. After going public as America's first former jihadist, I realized that I thought I was de-radicalized because I had changed my ideas, but all of the trauma, all of the addiction, all of the problems that I faced before becoming a Muslim basically resurfaced. And I relapsed on drugs for the first time in 14 years, threw away the opportunity of a lifetime, because we say there's a difference between disengagement and de-radicalization. And I thought de-radicalization was just removing myself from an ideology.
Yeah.
But it actually requires you to fulfill and to replace that ideology and what you got. Because it's not an ideology. They say ideology, they don't understand. Ideology is a component of culture. It's a culture. It's meaning, significance, purpose, community. There's all those other variables you get from being an extremist. In fact, extremism is quite empowering for people that don't have power, especially as terrorism is a weapon of the weak against the rich and the powerful. And so I hadn't replaced all of that. And I've spent my time since then doing my own thing, developing an organization called Parallel Networks, co-founded, interestingly enough, with Mitch Silber, the former director of intelligence at the NYPD.
A friend of mine from NYPD. Yep, I've known Mitch quite well.
And he spent many years of his life with update on me every day on his desk. And that was the missing ingredient, truth be told, is having a respectable figure who cared about me and was able to overlook the criticism of my relapse at George Washington University and still realize that I had a very unique take on things that could be valuable, that we had an ability to do really good work. And it has been a hell of a ride, because we've been very critical of the field of CVE, but we're still in the game. And now we've advanced to the point where we have a really functioning organization that is stable financially, and we've pulled now it's like 225 people out of respective movements, from jihadism to involuntary celibates to far right extremists to even a couple of militant far leftists to conspiracy theorists to anti-vaccine COVID conspiracy theorists, etc. And looking at how to do this properly has been fascinating, because I know of no other initiative, even though what's portrayed publicly is very different. I'm kind of like You know how you have a former extremist who has inside information that's valuable? Well, my experiences with the countering violent extremism community were fascinating because everybody tried to use me because I'm great for fundraising, right?
Right.
This story, right? So like
Right.
I know all of the organizations and I know the cabal that sort of runs the show and how the inner workings. So there's a book there not about, the erroneous, conceptions that drive the CVE industry, and it is an industry. And so in order to segue into the conversation, I think that that we're going to have, I'll end there.
It's quite fascinating, Jesse. I think it's important for our listeners to get that insight as to, where you came from and what it was that led you to Islam, and then eventually led you to violent extremist Islam, i.e., and I'm really glad you brought up the distinction between disengagement and de-radicalization. It's one that people tend to gloss over, but I think it really, really is important. And as I said in my initial comments, obviously I'm very biased as a former counterterrorism analyst with the security service. You need to convince me pretty deeply that you no longer pose a threat to national security or public safety. Otherwise, we see what happened in like I said, the November attack in 2019 in London. A guy who said all the right words and probably acted the way that they wanted him to, and lo and behold, he ends up stabbing 2 people to death. You've been described by some people, including Rukmini Callimachi, who I know quite well in the New York Times, as a major proselytizer recruiter for Al-QAEDA in the early 2000s. Is that an accurate depiction of who you were back then?
Well, I think that there's an easy ability to understand that as if I was in communication with Osama bin Laden and taking orders, right?
Right.
But in fact, if you define Al-QAEDA as what it became during my era, then yes, it's true.
Okay.
Because, as you know, Abu Musa Basori, Ayman
Yep.
al-Zawahiri, Osama himself started to proselytize this idea that Al-QAEDA can no longer be a hierarchical top-down organization because we're under assault in Waziristan and Pakistan and blah, blah, blah. So what we need to become is a movement that's driven by the dissemination of our ideas. Right. And everybody everywhere that supports this cause has an obligation to do so as much as they can. Now, I'm an American kid who has loyalty or bayah, whatever you want to call it, to Osama bin Laden. So I'm sitting in the United States. When an Arab kid hears that, they're like, yeah, well, I can't really do much. If I speak like this, I'm going to end up in prison. But I am protected by the First Amendment and all the great things that Western society brings. So, yeah, I mean, as far as like being able to unabashedly support Osama bin Laden and say we love Al-QAEDA more than we love ourselves and encourage people to commit acts of terrorism by walking up to the fine line between the First Amendment is dangerous. And I would say that, the numbers of people that we radicalized, I mean, the numbers, I don't think any Western element has ever like reproduced the number of views that we would get. We created a 24/7 radio station in Pal Talk. I'm sure you're well aware of the Pal Talk phenomenon. People laughed at it when it came out in the Snowden releases that, hey, what's Pal Talk doing on there? Who the hell knows what Pal Talk was? In fact, it was a really powerful platform that operated in many ways like Telegram does today. There's a paper that people can read, Mitch and I wrote for New America Foundation, that shows that a lot of what we did, the innovation that we did, was merely setting a stage for the methodology that the Islamic State adopted. And there's a reason for that. Many of our followers were embedded with, leaders in the Islamic State. John George Alis, for example, from Texas, he was supposed to travel to New York City to join Revolution Muslim, and instead flew to Egypt, where he lived for a year or two before ISIS announced its caliphate. Many years actually, 4 or 5, and then ISIS announced its caliphate, and he ended up being close with Abu Muhammad al-Adnani. So the influence that we had, I think, left a legacy that lasted a lot longer than most. And what it did was we translated the message in a way where it was like Al-QAEDA on Madison Avenue. Al-QAEDA in Hollywood, right?
Exactly.
So that it appealed to the West. And so, but it was the ability, it was the creativity that American society, it's dangerous when you have somebody who's sort of tech savvy and thinks like a Hollywood, director and knows how to manipulate people from being on the street. I do think, and I say this with all due amends, right? But it is important to understand that the radicalization phenomenon, because it's important to understand for 2 reasons. Number one, the far right is replicating exactly what we did with regard to their adaptations. But number two, sort of changed the landscape of radicalization with regard to the utilization of social media to facilitate that radicalization process. And it translated the message in a way that was appealable to a Western audience that really
I want
was
I,
dangerous.
I want to pick up on that a bit, Jesse. 'Cause you've said an awful lot here about radicalization. My very first book, The Threat from Within, was basically a summary of what we were seeing from a security service perspective about what people who are adopting these ideologies, what they do, what they say, what they act like. And the one thing you've mentioned on a few occasions, and I think it's really important, and people maybe underestimate this, is the critical importance of if not a spiritual leader, a charismatic individual who, as you said, can translate the message into language you understand, who can adapt it to your circumstances. You talked about sort of the Madison Avenueization, if you will, of the message. You mentioned Al-Awlaki. When I was working for the security service, every English-speaking person that we were concerned about had Al-Awlaki on speed dial. They were listening to his lectures because, of course, he was brought up in Virginia. He spoke fluent American English. Just how important, in looking back now, is that presence of a charismatic person that can really say, Jesse, this is what it means, and this is what it means for you, and this is why you should be following this particular ideology.
Well, remember that one of the primary reasons I referenced that sort of psychological fracture as a child and that messianic complex and that need for guidance. My father certainly wasn't involved in my life, and I find that to be a very serious correlatory issue, or an overly strict father also can create susceptibility. But in many ways, extremism and radicalization is not unlike joining a cult, and a cult needs a cultish leader.
Absolutely.
And so, yes, charismatic leadership is almost required, and what they become is a surrogate father. That's why Osama bin Laden is so powerful for particularly Arabic-speaking individuals.
Yes.
Like, he speaks just like a cult leader. If you were to watch a Indian guru speak soft, speak very humble, talk about very powerful ideas, but do so without any effect of, I'm not speaking violently because I'm speaking in the same monotone. I'm basically putting you in a trance. And in so many ways, that's what we recognized was most powerful about Abdullah Faisal. Abdullah Faisal was like the Bob Marley of radicalization. The Jamaican accent, had these catchy little slogans and phrases, and treat everybody like they were in his family. Anwar al-Awlaki, in many ways, kind of adopted what we had innovated with. He was close to us, but then was locked up in Yemen and suddenly appears with Al-QAEDA in the Arabian Peninsula, but left a legacy of scholarship that presented him as somebody who was willing to act on the ideas. And once he was someone who acted on the ideas, he cemented his legacy. And he was very, very powerful in being able to synthesize old texts, Ibn Kathir's work, the Sirah of the Prophet Muhammad, the biography of the Prophet Muhammad, but explain it in a modern way. So you're living with the Prophet Muhammad in an era of internet and interconnectivity.
Exactly.
Yes. So charismatic scholarship, particularly in Islam, is important, and it's one of the things that prevents the far right from becoming an actual movement.
They don't seem to have that stable of people who are absolutely that have that kind of personality that sort of amazes people and draws you in.
And also because there's no monolith. Like with Islam, you're dealing with 1,400 years of scholarship. And you're dealing with a unified core ideology that you can only deviate from to some degree. And with regard to the far right, we worry about them, but the best way to think about these things is to distinguish them, because in many ways we're seeing the far right in the same way we saw jihadism, and we're replicating the same mistakes and don't even realize it.
I agree completely.
And so they don't have charismatic leadership because they have very different ideological strands.
Yeah, exactly.
And they come from very different prioritized arenas. Some are white supremacists, some are anti-government. We say they're all white supremacists. A lot of them aren't racist at all. It facilitates that that process, just like they used to say jihadists were like women beaters and oppressed women, but our understanding of feminism was totally different. So they further facilitated our radicalization calls. They're doing the same thing today with gendered approaches to, countering violent extremism. So charismatic leadership is crucial.
Well, and I think this is one of the reasons why you look at the death of bin Laden, and of course Ayman al-Zawahiri took over, and he's got the personality of drawing paint. And I think as a consequence, I mean, I don't know whether in terms of recruiting ability, but when bin Laden was finally killed by U.S. forces in 2011, that left a huge gap that fortunately for us and unfortunately for them has yet to be filled by a person of an analogous capability. Because like I said, al-Zawahiri is not a bin Laden.
No, he's not.
He's qualified in terms of Islamic scholarship and stuff, but the way he brings it across is like people just want to fall asleep.
Indeed, but however, there is some benefit to that because of the rise of ISIS. Ultimately, I think the
Yes.
Wahhabi really saw that what was most important was that Al-Qaeda entered into a populist phase and destroyed the brand.
Mhm.
Osama bin Laden was trying to destroy the Al-Qaeda brand and to make it independent affiliates before he passed away. The Wahhabi does not have any charisma. But
Yeah.
for the people that are really, so they see things very differently. They're a populist movement, but they think that the populism needs to be driven by a small handful of scholars that go into an arena of jihad and educate, right?
Mhm.
The leadership. So they look at it as if you can get all of the imams in Mali to adopt the Al Qaeda worldview, then that will trickle down into disseminating and proselytizing throughout the entire region. And nobody will know that it's the actual Sheikh of Al Qaeda from Mauritania sitting in the hut
Mhm. Mhm.
training the imams that are
Right.
responsible for that, right? So
Right.
I think the Wahhabi, as a strategist, is a genius.
Mhm.
But in so many ways, I think we give too much credit to these people as if they are 7 feet tall.
Yeah. No.
Um,
Yeah. Exactly.
my
Exactly.
interaction with jihadist people, like Abdullah Faisal was an idiot. I had to position him and tell him what to do because he just didn't, he was all about narcissism. Omar Bakri Muhammad was a fool. Anjem Chowdhury, I can't say anything other than that the guy's at best has a GED, general
Yeah.
equivalency diploma with regard
Yeah.
to his thinking on Islam. So, but we tend to portray these guys as like, brainwashing, really powerful like people, and really at the end of the day, they're dimwits.
Well, and
Um,
I'm really glad you raised that point because sort of analogous to that, we have also in the 20 years since 9/11, it's almost 20 years to the day in a couple of weeks, we have also described Islamist extremism, Islamist terrorism as this sort of worldwide existential threat to who we are. And I keep saying it's not existential. It is if you're in Afghanistan and maybe parts of northeastern Nigeria, parts of the Sahel, as you mentioned, parts of Somalia, and now parts of northeastern Mozambique. But for the rest of us here, it's not an existential threat, as you said, run by 7-foot people who are absolute heroes and giants among us. And it worries me that we've allowed the conversation to get to that point where we have made much more of this phenomenon than it deserves, and hence our response, the ill-named war on terrorism, was a consequence of that. And we see what's happened with that, not just in Afghanistan but elsewhere. Jesse, I want to just ask one more question. I've got a funny feeling I'm going to bring you back on the podcast because there's so much to unpack here. You talked about Obama's emphasis on CVE during his second term as president. I remember it very well. At the time, I was with Public Safety Canada in the National Security Directorate. We were doing CVE in Canada. Myself and a good friend of mine with the RCMP, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, he was my equivalent as an analyst, were brought in as sort of the two old wise men that were going to talk about radicalization and stuff. I never, and maybe it was my bias as a security intelligence analyst, 30 years in the business, I never walked away with a warm and fuzzy feeling about CVE writ large. Now, I know each country is running it differently. And I know that, there's a whole spectrum between early intervention versus people who are already showing signs versus quote unquote de-radicalization kind of thing. Maybe an unfair question, but can you sort of summarize for my listeners how you view the collective CVE industry as of, latter half of 2021?
Yeah, I mean, number one problem is it's completely reactionary. Countering violent extremism makes the enemy you're trying to counter 10 foot tall.
Yeah.
Right. So, like, you do fulfill. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Al Qaeda was not a existential threat. We made them an existential threat by continuously talking about them. And when you talk about extremism, what you don't realize is you're actually doing the bidding of connecting people to the ideas. So the
Yeah.
vulnerable find out more about this organization that you are claiming is completely barbaric, but when they do closer investigation, they find out there's much more nuance to that.
Yeah.
So now we're dealing with the internal existential threat of white supremacy and not realizing that it was the reactive policies of the war on terror that created the anger and animosity of the working class and the lack of trust of institutions. So number one, it's reactionary, and it can't be reactionary. But the Obama administration's transition into CVE is a perfect example. Launched intentions to do CVE in 2011, but happened to occur as a policy that needed to be released. But in the releasing of that policy, they killed bin Laden. So nobody talked about doing anything It looked good for political purposes, but nobody cared because the war on terror was winding down. We killed bin Laden. It was over. That was the time to do CVE and to clean up some of the root causes. We didn't hear anything about it. And then all of a sudden, the Boston Marathon attacks occur, and we're like, oh my God, this is still a resonant ideology. Let's have a CVE summit. And the Obama administration, 2014, has this big CVE summit. Now we're going to get serious about CVE. They're going to allocate $10 million to a grant program that is going to, but the people that do CVE, that are involved in CVE as a sort of a practice that is very nascent, that evolved out of the United Kingdom and its initiation of the Prevent programming after the 2005 London bombings, has become an industry. And people are salivating at the opportunity to make more money.
Oh, absolutely.
And people are portrayed as experts, but when you talk to them, they don't understand what they're talking about. Exactly. They really don't. And if you're going to really do countering violent extremism, then you have to understand what you're dealing with. And so if you don't, and in any social service arena, you have to have a theory of change that drives your interventions. And if you don't have a theory of change that can be testable, then you can't develop monitorable and evaluable interventions. So nothing that was done scientifically. It was done as a reference to people who pretended they knew what they were talking about, but don't actually understand. People that think like that people arrive at radicalized ideologies by searching on Facebook for the Proud Boys. Things like this that continue to perpetuate in the field, just faulty underlying notions about how radicalization occurs, who it appeals to. And you can't do it unless you can put yourself in the hands and the shoes of an extremist or someone who's susceptible to extremism. And that's the number one problem, is they should then the idea that you have to keep law enforcement out of the game, right, is a big problem too, because there's only one collective that really understands this, and that's people like you. Yeah. Right. That's what makes me and Mitch such a potent combination.
Exactly. Right. Yeah.
But the idea is that when you put law enforcement on CVE, the people run away, because the same thing that was done. What would you expect Islamists to do but react to CVE as if, oh, this is all about investigating us. This is all about
recruiting sources. Us. Exactly.
It's great for you. You have a new grievance. The government's coming after you. Why not? So the Islamists who are not violent extremists, use this CVE as a tool. And the other thing that you have to be able to do if you're going to develop social service, and I should say that while I was a jihadist, I graduated from Columbia University with a master's degree in nonprofit management, Middle East studies. I ran for a decade of my life as Younes Abdullah Muhammad, an outpatient substance abuse mental health program in Brooklyn, New York. So all of these things that we know in addiction, mental health, the progresses that have been made in the field, nobody ever thought about taking social science interventions and learning from the development of evidence-based practice and putting it into CV. Said we were referring to moderate imams who have no traction. The idea that a moderate imam can play a role, right? Exactly. There's so many underlying faulty. Right now, we're trying to get progressive evangelical preachers to counter QAnon. Well, didn't we try that?
Been there, done. They got the T-shirt, right?
All we're doing is replicating the same mistakes, and all these people do that are predominant. So the powerful that had the first mover's advantage and the Matthew effect, and sort of, so the people that are considered to be the experts, right, in the field, I've been privy enough to know them, and I'm not talking about everyone. I am just saying that the number one incentive that drives it is money, limited resources, and the ability to profit. And the number of people that can falsely portray themselves as experts that really couldn't sit down and have an impromptu discussion about this stuff. They wouldn't be willing to. I've tried so many times. They need their notes, right? They need their latest report so they can just quote the recent key findings. And if you analyze any CVE report, you're like, there's no methodology here. Yeah. What is this? Yeah. And all of the wrong-headed underlying assumptions come out in the report. And largely what they've been able to achieve is they've become a big think tank to publish things that scare the public, that make the problem look bigger. And the whole intention is to profit. Doesn't that sound like the war on terror? The military-industrial complex and needing to create a threat that's larger than it actually is in order to profit off of it, but in the process to destroy your own system and to actually create what we're really looking at now, and nobody wants to talk about it, is the complete collapse of the liberal world order. Yeah.
Yeah.
And part of that, and a very small minor effect, is the replication of the same hubris, the same misunderstandings, the same inability to understand that people all across the world and people that are poor and working class people are people too. So it's a
Yep.
very ivory tower approach,
Yep.
and it needs to be changed. But I will say, in all fairness, there's a lot of momentum and progress to learn these lessons, and there's just no organization
Mhm.
or individuals that have you can't challenge the status quo, because the minute you do, you're not cool on Twitter.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, you're
Yeah.
ostracized, and they'll
Yeah.
silence you, because it's almost like the Wizard of Oz. If you pull back the curtain,
Yep.
right, then the industry ends.
Yeah.
And the people that are controlling the industry are actually making problems worse, but they don't even realize it, because they
Yeah.
think they're doing God's work, so to
Yeah,
say.
yeah. I couldn't agree with you more. And I've been part of many CVE efforts here in Canada and around the world. And I, when I'm feeling generous, I like to say these people, at least their heart's in the right place,
Yes,
if
they
even if
are.
they don't understand what they're doing. But you're right; it was a money making thing, I think, from the beginning. Jesse, as well as I do, when any government, especially a Western government, says we've got X number of millions of dollars to do, whatever, everyone's hand goes up. I was just joking with a friend just last night, in fact, how in the aftermath of 9/11, when a lot of U.S. states there's a lot of counterterrorism money was being thrown about, creation of fusion centers and all kinds of things. And a bunch of states were basically allowed to say, well, we need money for X, Y, or Z, or X, Y, or Z in your country. And I remember something like the Vermont Pumpkin Festival said, well, we think we're an Al-QAEDA target, so we need $100,000 to buy, these massive vehicles to prevent Al-QAEDA from hitting the Pumpkin Festival. And I think CVE has suffered from exactly that same unfortunate result, is that people see dollar signs and they say, well, yeah, I'm going to sign up for that, and I'm going to create a program. Whether or not it's good or not is not really all that relevant. And, we're in a situation where we are right now.
Yep, indeed, and I do think that it is a necessary component of all Western societies. There needs to be a preventing and countering violent extremism platform. Here in the United States, I couldn't applaud more the people at the Department of Homeland Security that are responsible for this stuff. They've been very slow. Contrary to popular opinion, there was no short-sightedness with investigating and doing CVE with the rising threat of domestic extremism. They've now developed a public health approach. A lot of this is from influence from the courageous people that are able to, speak up regardless of the fact the industry has become cool kids at a lunch table in a high school cafeteria. And a lot of that was conversations with people like Mitch and myself, that, you need a holistic approach. It needs to be based in science. You have public health approaches that deal with complexities. You don't need to rebuild the wheel, but you do need the creativity of people like former jihadists that actually know what the hell they're talking about.
Exactly.
When you do these things. And sometimes referencing the ivory tower is going to make matters worse. I mean, nobody's made more money off of the war on terror than radicalization researchers sitting in colleges to develop these papers. And you read these academic papers, and if you really know what you're talking about, you're like, okay, the methodology is flawed. It tells us nothing. But not only does it tell us nothing, if people are going to base policy and practice off this stuff, they're going to apply stuff that this paper here through the academic journal is already a year and a half old.
Yeah.
And now by the time you read it, it's going to be another year and a half old.
Yeah.
So you're going to be pulling from data, and as well as I do, especially in jihadism, the landscape can change overnight. Look at the Taliban. We weren't even talking about jihadism. We were talking about dismantling white supremacy and not stigmatizing Muslims, and like moving on from that and dealing with the real threat. And we never connected the real threat of white supremacy to the war on terror, to the lack of attention to resources at home and to other, variables and consequence of that. And now overnight,
look where we are now.
Now we're going to react.
Exactly.
Right. And we should have been proactive. And that, and you and I could have, had they come consult with us instead of their, military brass, we would have said, it's highly likely Taliban takes over the country. And here's the second order consequences of that. And even if they don't take over the country and they just control half of the country, you get a safe haven, but you also get a level for the jihadists to proclaim that, that war of attrition that bin Laden announced in 2005, where he said he was going to bleed you to bankruptcy like the USSR. Even if the Taliban didn't take over the country, jihadism would be back on the horizon, because Bin
Yeah.
Laden's victory is now in
Yeah.
their minds clear. If you keep
Well,
fighting and you stay patient, you
yeah.
will bleed to bankruptcy the superpowers. And David and Goliath narrative is the predominant narrative that drives radicalization and recruitment, no matter what kind of entity you're dealing with. You have to realize that you're dealing with very small subsets of the population. And what's appealing is like, we're going to rise against all the grievances
Yep.
that you hold, tear down the society and rebuild it in our image. Do you want to join us?
And that's exactly what the jihadi groups around the world are saying. It is a David and Goliath story. This is 79 all over again when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, et cetera, et cetera. Jesse, I am definitely going to have you back because there's so much in our conversation today that I need to pick up on in a much greater way. I just want to thank you very, very much for taking the time to talk to me. I've known you for a number of years. I have a great deal of respect for what you're doing. As I said, I've known Mitch Silber since the early 2000s when I went to New York and talked to the New York Police Department Counterterrorism Division. Thank you so much for being part of the podcast, and we'll talk again very, very soon.
And thank you as well. I do appreciate your critical lens too. We need more of it, and I'd be honored to be back on. Thanks.
So that was my conversation with Jesse Morton. What do you think about CVE and the use of former terrorists to talk to current terrorists? Love to hear your feedback. You can reach me on email, borealisrisk@gmail.com, or on Twitter @borealisa. So also find me on LinkedIn and on Facebook. If you like the content, want to get more, go to the website, www.borealisthreatandrisk.com. Hit the subscribe button. You get a free daily digest of all the material, as well as a link to my new book, The Peaceable Kingdom, The History of Terrorism in Canada from Confederation to the Present. Love to hear your feedback, guys. We'll talk again soon. Until then, stay safe.